This is an exclusive excerpt from the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder.
We've had Larry Milberry on the show before. He publishes books on aviation. His latest book that he co-wrote with Hugh A. Halliday is a timely tome called The Royal Canadian Air Force, 100 Years of Service. It chronicles the rich history of Canada's military aviation. Larry joins us via Zoom from Toronto. Hi, Larry.
Hi, Peter.
Always a pleasure to have you on the program. Now, we've chatted several times, but I don't think the one question I asked you is, you are one of Canada's foremost aviation historians. How did you become that?
Well, I'll tell you something, Peter. As usual, these stories go way back in time. My brother and I, as little boys living in a mining town in northern Ontario, got interested in aviation right off the bat. We were 5 or 6 years old, and our father, being a prospector and a miner, knew about bush flying, and he was a general aviation fan. And then the real big break for me, though, in aviation came when I joined Air Cadets when I was 12 years old in Toronto. And from Air Cadets, myself and several good pals all stayed in this, so it kept our interest in aviation going. 2 or 3 of the fellows became pilots. They're quite renowned by now. Others went into different things. I went into teaching, for example. But we always kept this interest up in aviation. And in our high school years, we would hitchhike around Ontario and Quebec, going to airports and air shows and whatnot. That's how it kind of all got rolling. And I just, I sometimes say I was dumb enough to try and make a living out of it.
Yeah, and you have, because you have CanAv Books, which has a lot of aviation books that are out. Let's talk about the one that is currently in the forefront, and that is the Royal Canadian Air Force, 100 Years of Service. And by the way, I should mention right now that all of your books, I've picked up several of them, and they're great coffee table reads. They have great pictures, they have great stories. So if you're into aviation, that's something you should check into. But let's talk about the new one, the Royal Canadian Air Force, 100 Years of Service.
So going back about almost 7 years, I realized that the centennial of the RCAF was coming up. Now, 40 years ago, in 1984, I published the 60th anniversary of the RCAF. So it seemed quite natural to latch on to this golden opportunity, in a way, of doing the 100 history of the RCAF. And so 6 or 7 years ago, Hugh Halliday and I, Hugh lives in Ottawa, he's a retired historian from the Canadian War Museum, we conspired to start this project going. And of course, a massive project. And I thought, okay, 6 years is going, surely we can finish this book in 6 years. Well, we started at it and it went nonstop, many weeks, literally 7 days a week, and the long, long days, 15, 16 hours. And come the centennial year, 2024, we were barely finished. And I really wished that we had started a year earlier. But recently, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we finally published this history. However, along the way, the book about the RCAF centennial turned into 2 books. So volume 1 is now in print. Volume 1 covers from the very beginning of the RCAF in 1924, and even before that, because I like to lay the groundwork to 1924. And the book ends with the end of the Second World War. So before the centennial year ends of the RCAF in April of 25, I hope like heck that we are able to publish the second volume. It might be a little late, but it doesn't really matter. So the volume 2 will take the story of the RCAF from the end of the Second War to the present.
So since that is the case, you're doing it in 2 volumes. I have to ask the obvious question. You put out the 60th anniversary one 40 years ago, literally. And so what's the difference between the one you put out 40 years ago and the one you're putting out now, with, of course, the exception of the fact that you have 40 more years to play with? How different is it in look and scope from what you originally had done 40 years ago?
Now that's a great point of discussion. Look and scope, not too different. The 60th anniversary book, by the way, it has become the single volume source of basic RCAF history, and that's the book that any half serious reader goes to get a foundation knowledge of the RCAF. But in those subsequent 40 years, a lot has happened. Obviously, we cover the initial 60 years, and people say, well, I guess it's all the same stuff. Well, exactly wrong. What we've tried to do and have succeeded at doing is we've covered the first 60 years with nearly all new material. There's no shortage of great material out there. And then the subsequent 40 years up until the present, of course, so much has happened in those intervening years. And so we cover that stuff. For example, when 60 years came out, the F-18 Hornet, which you know about, and that's our lead fighter plane presently still after 40 years, it was a brand new airplane. Now it's an old, creaky, dusty airplane, but it's still in service because Ottawa just hasn't gotten around to ordering a replacement. Well, until just recently, they finally bit the bullet and ordered some F-35s, but we won't see a single F-35 until 2026. So there's all that new material. The Aurora patrol plane in 1984 was new. Now the Aurora is a vintage airplane, but still frontline equipment for the RCAF because they only lately this year have ordered a replacement for that one. So it's funny that those 40 years ago airplanes, many of them are still all we've got in the RCAF.
Well, in the course of 100 years, in the course of anyone's lifetime, you have ebbs and flows. So if you were to highlight the pinnacle of the RCAF's existence, what would that period be in that 100 years?
Probably at least two pinnacles. The Second World War absolutely put the RCAF largely on the map. When the Second World War started, the RCAF had 270 airplanes, nearly all of them obsolete, and only 4,000 members. Suddenly, September 39, Second World War begins, the RCAF explodes almost overnight, and eventually by 1945 war's end, it's the fourth largest air force in the world. With about 250,000 Canadians wore the RCAF uniform in the Second World War. We contributed on every front in that period of 39 to 45. We trained in Canada more than 130,000 aircrew. Our aircrew excelled in bomber command and fighter command and the U-boat war and all that good stuff. And suddenly the war ended, and the Air Force, as did every Air Force in August, from August of 45 on, with the end of the war, shrank overnight down to almost nothing again. Then, again, world conditions were favorable to building up Canada's military, and that, of course, became the post-Second World War Cold War, starting with the Korean War and then going into the Cold War, chiefly in Europe, with the threats coming from the Soviet Union and so on. So the RCAF, again, literally by 1955, had thousands of airplanes. We had, for example, in the RCAF, fighters alone, the F-86 Sabre that was built in Montreal, the RCAF had more than 1,000 of these F-86s alone. 500 or more T-33 jet trainers and so on. And then as the Cold War subsided, so did the Air Force. And the Air Force, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, about 1990, the RCAF has really shrunk. And it's almost back to what it was in a way in 1939. Would you believe that the RCAF today has the same number of airplanes it had on the eve of war in 39? We have only in the RCIF about 270 airplanes to this day. And so, there are these great waves of activity, and then there are the downside of it when budgets shrink and the government loses interest.
Well, if anybody has any interest in aviation, particularly Canadian aviation, you should check out Canav Books. They're online at canavbooks.wordpress.com. The latest book is The Royal Canadian Air Force, 100 Years of Service. Larry, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you very, very much for taking the time to be on with us.
Thanks a million, Peter. All the best.
Larry Milberry, co-author of The Royal Canadian Air Force, 100 Years of Service. Again, I can't stress enough that if you're an aviation buff, especially about Canadian aviation, you need to check out canvabooks.com. You can also check out Larry's blog at canvabooks.wordpress.com, and you can go to our website at thestuffile.com, check out the show number for this program, which is show number 0790, and you'll find the link to the blog and also their website where you can order their books.
You've just heard an exclusive excerpt from the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder. To hear any or all of the full hour-long shows, visit thestuffile.com. Stuff is spelled S-T-U-P-H. That's thestuffile.com. A presentation of Flying Fish Communications.